Uh, Hi, good. Let me just see what happens if I. Okay. Good morning. I First of all, I want to say I feel a bit of a fish out of water because when I saw the notice for this conference, having some responsibility for archives, I thought I want to hear what people are saying internationally, what is happening at Caribbean archives and things like that. And I wrote asking whether I could attend. And the next thing I knew, I was asked to make a presentation. So my field is not print so much at all. Really, it is video. And though, of course, it has a lot of print dimensions. I just want to say that from very small, 9, 10 years, I remember being at the side of the Trinidad Carnival stage, helping who was to become the first, the premier international carnival expert anthropologist, Daniel Crowley, as he recorded on his wire recorders the folk speech of the midnight robber, the traditional characters, or the Pierrot Grenade, or the Black Indian. And then later seeing that the transcriptions of those speeches reproduced, someone mentioned the Caribbean Quarterly in the Carnival edition of the Caribbean Quarterly in the late 50s. And reading them over and over and getting an understanding of where literature comes from, where art comes from often, from the traditional, from the folk, and how it transfers from the oral tradition into a print edition. And of course, at the same time, at home, my mother would be playing records of Dylan Thomas's reading from Under Milk Wood, or speeches from Shakespeare by the young Gielgud or Olivier, and understanding also, therefore, how a recording not only can be transcribed and preserved that way, but also can change the perspective and the way in which one can enjoy literature. So that it was kind of natural to me growing up that the oral tradition was very, very intertwined with written tradition. And Ken mentioned that earlier on. I'm glad he did. It made me feel a little more relevant. So I just mentioned that because some 40 years ago, we started Banyan, which is one of the first independent television production companies here, or program production companies. And over those 40 years, we have, our mission was really to capture, to have ourselves see ourselves, because our television environment is such that certainly then, and probably even more now so, less than 5 or 6% of what you see on television is really about us, unless we're a victim in the news, or a sportsman, or someone jumping at a carnival parade. But our stories weren't being told, our daily lives were not being appreciated, and the things that everyone else takes for, in other countries takes for granted, a sort of objectification of one's lives, wasn't happening. So one couldn't just watch the television or the cinema and say, oh, that's what we do, that's how we act, that's what our lives are like. We had no way of doing that. We had to filter everything through seeing these foreigners, their lives, and relating that to ours. And that was the world that I lived in, not so much definitely in print, though I did publish a magazine for some time in the 70s. So over the 40 years, we managed to gather some, what we call the Caribbean Motion Picture Archive, which some over 3,000 tapes, videotapes. This is, there was no funding. This is things we did by, well, I would actually have to sort of grab a tape when it came back into the studio, saying, no, 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 you can't go and record over it. We have to hold that. This is important. And so I'd say some 3,000 tapes, some 2,000 hours of video over the last 40 years, which contain, to some extent, literary, well, quite a big extent, literary material. There's just a list of some of the writers who we have interviews with, who are reading their material or talking about their material. Martin Carter is there also. We have about an hour or two of him not only reading his stuff, but talking about what it means and why and how. So some of these interviews might be 5 minutes, some of them might be 6 hours. Professor Ramchan helped us a lot in a 3-hour interview with Derek Walcott, 1980, and again with some 6 hours with C.L.R. James around the same time. And so we have the 3 hours of interviews with Walcott talking about his poetry, and another 3 hours of him talking about his drama and his theater. So the interviews vary in length and in nature, and this does not include interviews with critics, commentators, editors, relatives of writers that are past. A pet project of mine that Ken has helped a lot with is the work of a writer called Harold Sonny Ledoux, who published 2 novels before he was killed in the mid-70s. And I have been working ever since on a documentary about his life, and in the process gathering manuscripts that both from his publishers in Canada, the National Library in Canada, in Quebec, and also from his relatives, unpublished manuscripts of short stories, fractions of novels. One of his stated aims was to write some 200 novels, a whole cycle of the Caribbean history. He wanted to be the Faulkner of the Caribbean. But nevertheless, that's just, so this does not include, this list here does not include all the interviews I did with his editors of his novels, his publishers, his relatives, both here and in Canada, and so on. And that would relate to other writers also. So, but, all right, we have all this material, and it has been for decades an anxiety for me to some extent, in saying, well, what would happen if if I die? What's going to happen to this stuff? Because the most we had in terms of catalog was a list of titles of the tapes. Very little in terms of details of what was on each tape. And I just felt, well, you know, something happens, this thing is just going to be put in a landfill. But to us, it represented a huge core of our heritage and our lives in the last 40 years. And we have greater detail in the years between mid-80s and mid-90s. Because we produced a cultural magazine program every week for 6 years, and that really gathered a lot of detailed information and detailed representation of people and what they're doing in the country and how they live their lives. Now, I tried very hard. I've been trying very hard to get things digitized. I felt that digitizing this thing was absolutely important, and more important, once digitized, it really needs to be the metadata, or the detailed cataloging of it, is what is going to make it worthwhile. Because even if you digitize it and you have all your files, it doesn't mean anything to anybody unless someone goes through each one. And how would they identify what's on each file? Because a lot of that memory has been lost, and a lot of people. Well, luckily, I've shot most of it myself, and so I figure I'm the best person to write it. But I've had experience. People say, why don't you get some intern to come and write up the thing? And you put a young person or anybody in front of this material, and they don't know who it is. Fella in a red shirt, it's C.L.R. James, So it's very difficult to understand how you're going to actually make this accessible and useful. Some 3 years ago, I managed to attract a pilot project between the University of York in Canada and University of West Indies here to do a pilot project of 50 hours of the material, which was pretty successful. And the University of York digitized the material, and the University of West Indies paid for the metadata to be written. And but they had stopped. University of West Indies could not. They were the library was very, very interested in acquiring the material, in getting it into their collection and so on, and continuing with the digitizing, but could not raise the money either internally in the library or through the state or through corporate sponsors, where they tried for some 3 years, and this negotiation went on for some time. But York University continued, and we now have digitized some third of the collection, about 500 or 600 hours, and we've upped the ante a little bit, because University of York. Let's go back a bit. Can I go back? Oh, Jesus. University of York has last December, 13 crates of tapes went to Canada. I hung on for years trying to make sure it stayed here. 13 crates, right? There they are, packed up to go to Canada, to York University, and I figure within the next 18 months, they will have completed the digitization of the core of the archive. And the National Annales here has now also stepped in to help write the metadata, and so that that's my full-time job, more or less, writing the metadata for it. So I figure within about 6 months after they finish digitizing, we will have the core of the archive in, I think that I had a shot of, sort of what the metadata involves, because it involves not just information about the formats and description of the content, but of course where each shot was shot, who was involved, who are the participants in each shot, and any keywords that come across. You can't possibly read this fine print, but it gives you an idea of the amount of work. At the moment, some 7,600 records have been written for the third of the archive. So I would imagine another 15,000 records. So you're going to end up with something like 20 or between 20 and 30 records, which would be searchable just by any means. This is just a piece of an Excel file, so that one would be able to just enter the name of any place or person that you're interested in, and then all their stuff will come up. It'll be linked to the video, and it will all come up for you to see it right away. That would be a real dream for me to see that happen, because then I know I could dead. Because anybody could then take that and find whatever they want out of it. Where is it located? Of course, I have copies of everything that is digitized, and York has copies. Between the University of the West Indies Library and NALIS, they have copies also, with the understanding it's specifically for their internal use. It is not for public use. It is not to be on the web yet, because that's the next stage, access. We're talking about access. The ideal thing would be that anyone in the world should be able to just dial in and see this stuff, or listen to it, or whatever. But that would require setting up some infrastructure, either through a university, a library, or even a private institution, to do what is being done with commercial videos at the moment. The Netflixes and the Hulus and the Apple TVs and so on. Either through a subscription. At the moment, for example, the archive is sustained, the rent for the archive is sustained by selling DVDs to libraries and universities. And they pay hundreds of dollars of US just for one DVD. The idea that something could be put in place where universities or libraries pay a subscription of a few $1,000s a year or whatever it is to a central server for access to this material seems to be an obvious one. But the academic world seems to be a little behind the commercial world. And one of the reasons why I came here, I wanted to find out what exactly was happening in terms of the literary archive internationally. But it seems to be an obvious thing. I know you've talked a lot about the actual original manuscript. But to some extent, my concentration has been on digitizing. If you can digitize our stuff at the same quality that the tape is, as far as I'm concerned, the tape is of interest to the archivist maybe, but I'm more interested in the content and what is on it. And that needs to be accessible. Now, to sort of lead back, and just to finish off to some extent, the important thing of what I'm saying is a lot of people have been talking for decades about digitizing the video archives and even the written archives throughout the Caribbean. I've been to many meetings and conferences throughout the region. They say, yes, we need to digitize, but up to now, there's very little actually happening. I feel privileged that I've been able to actually reach as far as we have to actually be doing the work. The Government Information Service here has started doing digitizing their work. But in terms of the culture of the region, our specialization has been cultural stuff, not necessarily industrial, commercial, or political. Political to some extent, but it has been, most of those 3,000 tapes are dealing with cultural aspects in the widest sense of the word culture. And I don't think there's anything like it in the region, or at least in this Anglophone Caribbean. And if we can make this happen, and hopefully over the next 2 years we will actually have this entity, this thing, which will be a virtual archive of life in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean. A lot of our stuff is from other parts of the Caribbean as well. Then we'll have that record there for anyone to look at. If those tapes were not digitized and they just started to, at the moment they're in pretty good shape, but what's even worse in terms of time is that the machines to play them are becoming less and less available, and the spare parts for them less and less available. So that's one of the hurries, one of the things that really hurry us up, because we've managed to keep it in a controlled environment over the years, and they're all playing. 30 or 40 years old, they're still playing. But to get the machine to play them and make sure that that machine is kept at a particular standard, I have about 3 of each type of machine, and I sort of switch things around just to keep them playing. So I'll just end there and hope that I have made what contribution I can, because I go back to the point about the way in which the oral culture the visual culture can give you so many different perspectives and dimensions of the literary world. I will just, on a sort of lighter note, and to some extent following up from Ken's reference, let me see if this, I will end with a picture there of Sam Selvon meeting and talking to one of his main characters from his novel, A Brighter Sun, Soapdale, in a bar in eastern Trinidad. So the video actually talks about language to some extent. Selvon talks to Soapdale, and Soapdale talks to Selvon about how he deals with the language that Soapdale speaks. And so it's an example of how you can take a literary element and make another, so many other dimensions of it. And the value of a funny little encounter like that, especially to younger people, who, as you said, his own children didn't know how important he is. I don't think anyone would be able to recognize, if you ask any Trinidadian in the street who that person was, they wouldn't know. And even if they said Selvon, they still may not know what you're talking about. So I just... That's Errol Theta Hall playing Soapdale. Yes, so I leave you at that. Thank you very much.